The quiet landowner. I never asked for much from life. A quiet stretch of land, a place to watch the sun dip behind the hills, and the freedom to live on my terms. That's all I wanted. But life, and especially HOAs, have a way of testing you, pulling you into battles you never imagined you'd fight. My name is Eli Dawson, and until 5 years ago, I was just a soft-spoken 60-something-year-old with a deep love for solitude. I lived in Whispering Pines, a once sleepy town now under siege by unchecked development. Whispering Pines used to be the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where the general store still sold candy by the ounce, and where summer nights were filled with cricket song and not the grind of construction equipment. I inherited my 80-acre tract from my grandfather, who bought the land in the 1940s. He was a proud man, a surveyor by trade, and he taught me that land is more than just dirt. It's legacy. When he passed it down to me, he made me swear I'd never sell it to developers. And I didn't, not even when the offers started coming in. Low at first, then absurdly high. But things took a turn when the Birchwood Homeowners Association came into play. The first crack in the piece. The Birchwood HOA was the brainchild of a notorious local developer named Clinton Granger. Tall, tan, and dripping with arrogance, Clinton had that fake charm only real estate moguls seem to perfect, a smile that never reached his eyes. His pitch to the town council, a master-planned community with 100 luxury homes, a golf course, and a state-of-the-art community center. He called it Birchwood Reserve. The council fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. But there was a catch. Birchwood Reserve needed more land than Clinton legally owned. My land, a key 40-acre section that lay nestled between his proposed development and the only road access to the highway. Without it, his entire project was a landlocked dream. Clinton offered to buy it. Twice, then a third time. Each time I told him the same thing. This land isn't for sale. That's when the friendly facade started to fade, and the HOA machine began its slow creep into my life, harassment by policy. Even though my land wasn't part of their development, the HOA tried to claim that because Birchwood Reserve now surrounded parts of it, I had to comply with visual harmony ordinances. First they mailed letters, then fines. When I ignored them, they started getting more aggressive. My mailbox was vandalized. I'd find notes on my fence telling me to clean up my property. One morning, a crew came and started trimming trees on my land, claiming they spilled into HOA airspace. I filed complaints, called the sheriff. But Clinton had deep pockets and knew how to keep things legal, or at least murky enough to avoid consequences. Then, one day, everything escalated. The construction mistake. I came back from a week-long trip to visit my sister, only to find bulldozers tearing into the edge of my property. Not near the edge, not along the line. A good 50 feet into it, I slammed on the brakes, jumped out of my truck and shouted for them to stop. The foreman, a man named Ray, acted confused. "This is lot 36, he said. "No," I growled, pointing to the corner post I'd cemented in myself years ago. "This is my land, get off it," he argued. He claimed they had the proper plats, but they didn't. Their surveyor had accidentally redrawn the boundary line, conveniently carving out a swath of my land for the HOA. It was a mistake, they said. A misunderstanding, only they didn't stop. Over the next 3 weeks, they built 6 homes partially on my land, then 9, then 18. I watched from my porch, documenting everything. Neighbors asked why I wasn't stopping it. Some even assumed I had sold out, but I was patient, because I knew something they didn't. The trap. I said years ago, when I first started getting pressure from developers, I took my grandfather's advice and started studying property law. Not casually, obsessively. I found loopholes, dug through, dusty case files, even took online courses. And in 2020, I quietly had my land subdivided into 3 parcels, each under a different legal trust. Then I went a step further. I filed restrictive covenants on each parcel, making it illegal to build structures without explicit approval from the trust board, which was, of course, me. When Clinton's team started encroaching, I let them. I wanted them to. Because the moment their foundations crossed into my territory, they violated the covenants and forfeited any claim to permanence. But that wasn't all. I had also done something else. Something I didn't think I'd ever need to do, but now was thankful. For I had wired motion sensor cameras all along my side of the property and archived every second of footage off-site. Every surveyor misstep, every dig, every house framed on my soil. Evidence indisputable, cold, hard proof. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. HOA Karen makes her entrance. Around this time, I met Karen Forsyth, the newly elected president of the Birchwood HOA. If Clinton was the hand that guided the HOA's plans, Karen was the sword. Middle-aged, crisp bob haircut, sunglasses even indoors, clipboard at all times. She was everything people joked about when they imagined HOA horror stories. Karen didn't introduce herself. She issued a formal notice demanding I cease operations on my unpermitted outbuilding, my grandfather's old barn. She said it was an eyesore. I invited her to my porch and calmly offered her some lemonade. She declined. "You can't keep this barn up, it lowers property values," she said smugly. I smiled. "Karen, this barn has been here longer than your HOA has existed." "Which means it's grandfathered in," she retorted. "But the fence? That's not." She pointed at my wooden fence. "The same fence they bulldozed over weeks ago." I nodded slowly. "You're right, Karen. It's not grandfathered in. It's yours now, along with all the houses built behind it." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. I just handed her a thick envelope. Inside, a certified notice of encroachment, a cease and desist order, and a lawsuit. Not just one, 3. One for each trust that owned the subdivided land. Each one demanded the immediate removal of all structures violating the covenants. Total damages requested. $18.6 million. Karen turned pale. I'd caught her off guard. The trap had been sprung, but this was just the beginning. The first time Clinton Granger saw the lawsuit papers, he smirked. That's what people like him do when they think their money and influence make them untouchable. He didn't read them right away. He had an assistant glance over the envelope, while he leaned back in a leather chair inside his glass-paneled office, overlooking Birchwood Reserve's sparkling faux lake. It was all show. Clinton's entire image was built on perception, pressed suits, sleek cars, and hollow confidence. But perception only carries a man so far when reality begins to collapse under its weight. Clinton underestimated me. To him, I was a dusty old relic, a reclusive landowner in worn flannel shirts, with boots covered in red Georgia clay. But what he didn't understand is that while he was chasing profit margins and selling dreams wrapped in stucco and HOA dues, I was preparing. I had been preparing for this exact moment from the day I saw that first bulldozer inch past the tree line. The lawsuit was not the end game. It was the matchstick, the spark. The lawsuits, all 3 of them, were filed in different jurisdictions, based on the trust designations, making it harder for them to be consolidated or delayed. I didn't just file for monetary damages. I filed for injunctive relief, essentially a court-ordered halt on all ongoing construction and the potential demolition of anything illegally built on my property. Clinton didn't laugh then. Instead, he scrambled. Within 2 days, I received a letter from Granger and Holt Law, a fancy Atlanta-based firm known for aggressive litigation tactics. The letter demanded I retract my lawsuits immediately and meet them for arbitration. I didn't respond. The next day they escalated. A new claim was filed against me, accusing me of deliberate obstruction of development and malicious delay. It was a poorly written countersuit meant to intimidate me into settling, what they didn't know and soon regretted learning. is that I wasn't alone. I had a team. Back in 2021, when I first suspected trouble, I began working with a small legal consultancy that specialized in property disputes, run by a woman named Denise Caldwell, a retired judge and one of the sharpest minds I've ever met. The consultancy had a quiet reputation for making developers' lives miserable when they stepped out of line. Denise and I had become friends over time, bonded not just by our mutual disdain for corporate arrogance, but by a shared belief in justice, real, deliberate justice. So when Clinton's lawyers fired their legal warning shot, Denise and her team responded with a full brief, documented evidence, footage, chain of title records, GPS-stamped property maps, and, most damning of all, surveyor interviews revealing that Clinton's project managers had knowingly altered boundary reports. That single revelation turned a civil suit into potential criminal fraud. Clinton wasn't laughing anymore, but things didn't unravel instantly. In fact, they got worse before they got better. Clinton wasn't ready to fold. He was rich, connected, and ruthless. He doubled down. Within a week of the filings, he launched a PR campaign claiming I was a bitter old man sabotaging affordable housing. He went on the local news, standing in front of one of the half-finished homes, arms crossed, pretending to care about displaced families and working-class dreams. It was a cheap stunt, but unfortunately, it worked on some. A few of my neighbors, many of whom didn't even know the full story, started giving me side glances at the farmer's market. One woman told me flat out that I should just let it go, as if 40 acres of my land being stolen was something I should overlook for the sake of her commute time. It was isolating, and there were nights when I felt the weight of it pressing on me like the humid summer air, thick, relentless, but I never wavered. Because while Clinton and the HOA were playing to the court of public opinion, I was winning in the real court. The judge assigned to my case, an older gentleman with decades of experience in land use litigation, was unimpressed by Clinton's showmanship. He was meticulous, thorough, and most importantly, fair. In the preliminary hearings, Clinton's attorneys attempted to argue that the mistake was inadvertent and that restitution could be resolved monetarily. But when Denise presented footage of their construction crews bulldozing my property, despite multiple visible markers and posted signs, the judge's tone shifted. In one memorable moment, he looked over his glasses at Clinton's legal team and said, "This doesn't look inadvertent, this looks willful." That sentence marked the beginning of the end for Clinton. But the HOA, especially Karen, wasn't going down without a fight. The HOA's desperate gamble. While Clinton battled me in court, Karen tried a different tactic. She began weaponizing the HOA bylaws to punish me in petty, vindictive ways. They mailed me violation notices nearly every week. The barn was too reflective, my dogs were unlicensed, and my well water tank violated aesthetic uniformity requirements. It was laughable, because my land wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. But they filed these claims anyway, hoping something would stick. Then came the most ridiculous attempt yet. Karen mailed a formal declaration that the Birchwood HOA was annexing my property for the good of the community. It was a thinly veiled attempt to claim control over my land retroactively, which would have been illegal even if she had gotten the signatures needed to make it stick. But unsurprisingly, she forged them. That was her fatal error. I turned over the document to Denise, who then coordinated with a forensic handwriting analyst. They confirmed the signatures for at least 3 board members had been traced and altered. When presented with this evidence, 2 of those board members resigned immediately, fearing legal consequences. The HOA, now fractured and leaderless, began imploding from within. Residents, many of whom had been lied to, began showing up at meetings demanding answers. Why were their HOA fees increasing every quarter? Why were they suddenly being named in a lawsuit they knew nothing about? Why hadn't Clinton disclosed that almost a quarter of their homes were built on land he didn't own? The illusion began to collapse. The turning point, it wasn't the lawsuits alone that turned the tide. It was time and truth. As the court proceedings dragged into the fifth month, public opinion shifted. Local media outlets, now armed with court transcripts and evidence, began running exposés. One headline read, "Developer built homes on stolen land. Now residents may be forced to leave." Another, "The man who outsmarted the HOA. How Eli Dawson beat the system. The same neighbors who once glared at me in the post office now shook my hand in the parking lot." Some apologized. A few even cried, especially the younger couples, terrified of losing their homes. And while I felt for them, the blame didn't lie with me. It lay squarely with Clinton, who thought rules were suggestions, and with Karen, who thought power made her above consequence. Still, I made a choice. Then that surprised even Denise. I instructed her to drop the monetary damages for 76 of the 96 homes. My condition, that the landowners agree to a new lease through my trust, which allowed them to stay, provided they paid a small annual land use fee and acknowledged the legal boundaries moving forward. It wasn't about money, it was about principle. And it was about making Clinton pay the real cost of his arrogance. I reserved full damages for the 20 homes still under construction, plus the HOA community center and clubhouse, which had been built directly over my eastern pasture. And those I demanded be torn down. When the final ruling came in, the judge upheld my right to the land, invalidated the forged annexation, and ordered Clinton's company to compensate me for all construction on my property, in addition to punitive damages for intentional boundary violations. The amount, $9.2 million. The HOA was dissolved 2 weeks later. Clinton's company, Birchwood Development LLC, filed for bankruptcy within 6 months. And Karen? She vanished. Rumor has it she moved to Florida, joined another HOA, and now fights her neighbors about mailbox heights and holiday decorations. Some people never change, but here, in Whispering Pines, peace finally returned. The community that rose from the ashes. When the dust settled and the headlines faded from the front pages of local newspapers, I found myself walking through Birchwood Reserve, though it wasn't called that anymore. The signs bearing the once polished, too perfect name had been torn down after the court ruling. The HOA office had been emptied overnight. The big mahogany desk Karen used to sit behind was gone, as if she'd never existed. But the homes remained, rows and rows of them, their beige siding and symmetrical shrubs still standing like soldiers without a general. What was once a proud, if overbearing, planned community had become something more vulnerable and uncertain, a village of people trying to figure out who they were without someone barking rules at them through fines and threats. I didn't feel victorious, exactly. I felt responsible. You see, while I had every legal right to let the consequences play out, to watch the bulldozers return, this time to tear down the homes illegally planted on my land, I chose not to. And that decision came with weight. It wasn't enough to win in court. What mattered now was what came after. Because when systems fall, especially corrupt ones, what rises in their place will define everything. In the weeks that followed the judgment, families who'd barely known my name began showing up at my gate. Some came hesitantly, children, in tow, unsure if I'd slam the door in their faces. Others came openly, curious about what kind of man could take on an empire and win. Most of them weren't bad people. They were just sold a dream, clean parks, perfect lawns, a quiet suburban life, and didn't look too closely at the fine print. They were mechanics, school teachers, single moms, retired veterans. And now they stood in legal limbo, their homes, perched on trust-owned land, unsure of what the future held. Rather than slam my door, I opened it. I sat on my porch with these people. I made coffee, passed around slices of sweet potato pie, and listened to their stories. A lot of them were just angry at Clinton, at Karen, at themselves for trusting the wrong people. Some were scared, thinking they'd lose everything. A few, very few, blamed me as if I'd caused the mess instead of stopping it. But most were just trying to find a path forward. One night, as fireflies danced through the oaks and my dog Molly dozed at my feet, a woman named Teresa Maddox sat across from me. A nurse at the county hospital, she had 2 kids and a mortgage on a house built smack in the middle of what used to be my southern pasture. She had tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but relief. "You could have taken everything," she said, "but you didn't. Why?" I thought about that for a moment, then I answered as simply as I could. Because this land has always been about more than just ownership. It's about how we live on it, and with each other. That was the moment. Things began to shift because people started realizing that they didn't need an HOA to tell them how to be neighbors. They just needed to start acting like them. Within a month, several families formed what they called the Birchwood Co-op. It wasn't a governing body. There were no fines, no mandatory paint colors or bylaws dictating curtain lengths. It was a community initiative designed to help residents coordinate everything from shared landscaping services to neighborhood watch groups. They elected Teresa as their first spokesperson. Not a president, no one wanted that title anymore, but a representative voice. I helped them set up a community bulletin board near the old HOA clubhouse, which was now in the process of being demolished. The residents decided to turn the cleared land into a public garden, open to anyone who lived in the area. They brought in local students to design mural walls. They set up raised beds and planted tomatoes, squash, and lavender. Kids painted stepping stones. Retirees donated benches. It wasn't polished or perfect, but it was alive. I leased each family a long-term land use agreement through the trusts, legally binding but fair. Instead of being gouged by hidden fees, they paid. A nominal lease that went into a community maintenance fund. I wasn't looking to get rich. I just wanted them to have a stake in something real. And they did. You could see it in the way they mowed not just their lawns, but the shared pathways. In the way they helped repair one another's fences or hung Christmas lights along the main trail, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It wasn't easy. There were disagreements, sure. One guy wanted to put up a giant metal rooster sculpture in his front yard. Another woman thought it was an eyesore, but instead of filing complaints or calling lawyers, they talked, they compromised. They joked about how, at least we don't need Karen's approval anymore. And eventually the rooster found a home behind a hedge, partially obscured, but proudly standing. Funny how conflict can be reshaped when people stop outsourcing their grievances to institutions and instead look each other in the eye. One of the biggest challenges came from the school district. Because the development had been rushed and improperly zoned, some of the families were technically outside the boundaries for the local elementary school, leading to chaos in enrollment. But instead of falling apart, the co-op rallied. They worked with the school board, brought in a retired administrator who lived in the community, and negotiated a provisional agreement that allowed their kids to stay enrolled with minimal disruption. The school saw that these weren't just passive residents, they were invested citizens, and so day by day, the ghost of the HOA faded. The fear that had once stalked the sidewalks, fear of compliance, fear of fines, fear of nonconformity, was replaced by something deeper. Respect, not uniformity, but harmony, not rules, but relationships. I still lived on the same porch, still watched the sun fall behind the ridgeline. But now, instead of the cold hum of machinery from Clinton's grooves, I heard laughter from kids playing in the community field. I saw teenagers planting flower beds instead of sneaking out to graffiti stop signs. I saw an old man who once called me a stubborn fool, now waving to me each morning as he walked his dog past my gate. There was one day, in early autumn, when I stood on the edge of my property with Teresa and a few others, watching a group of residents raise a new welcome sign. Not the birchwood branding nonsense, but a simple wooden post with carved letters that read, Whispering Commons, a place for neighbors. No one asked for permission to install it. They just did it together, and it was perfect. It made me think of my grandfather again. He always said, land is nothing if it doesn't serve the people on it. I used to think that meant protecting it from developers, from concrete, from greed. And it does, in part. But more than that, it means stewarding it, not just guarding it, but guiding it, making sure that when the land does serve people, it serves them well, with dignity, with equity, with heart. So much had been taken from this community, but so much more had been reclaimed, not just property lines and legal standing, but identity, integrity, the ability to shape their own lives without fear of bureaucracy or some clipboard tyrant dictating holiday light wattage. They had seen the worst of centralized power in the form of a bloated HOA, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and kinder. People ask me sometimes if I regret letting them stay, if I should have taken the money, sold the land, and walked away. And to that, I always say the same thing. I didn't let them stay. They earned it. Karen's return, the attempted takeover. It had been nearly a year since the collapse of Birchwood's infamous HOA, and life in Whispering Commons had settled into a rare kind of rhythm, one not dictated by official notices, lawn citations, or power-hungry enforcers, but by something much more human: respect. It was a quiet revolution, really. No proclamations, no speeches, just families building something together out of what used to be a legal battleground. You could feel it in the way people lingered longer on their porches or shared vegetables across property lines. The days of Karen Forsyth felt like a bad dream the neighborhood had finally woken from, but not every ghost stays buried. It was a breezy afternoon in late spring when the first signs of her return appeared. Not in person, not at first, but in paper. A thick packet of glossy brochures showed up at my doorstep, sealed in an envelope bearing a suspiciously vague sender, Civic Harmony Solutions, LLC. That alone sent a chill down my spine. The packet was filled with branding that had all the subtlety of a snake oil salesman's pitch. Stock photos of families grinning in perfectly manicured neighborhoods, bullet points about restoring standards and protecting investments, and most ominously, a proposed revitalization program for Whispering Commons. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Karen never could stay away from control. The woman was allergic to community without compliance. Inside the packet, tucked behind the fluff, was the meat of her newest plan: a petition to establish a new HOA, this time under a private management company operated by, you guessed it, Karen Forsyth herself. She was back, and she wasn't asking. She was demanding a return to proper order, only this time she came disguised. Karen didn't call it an HOA. She called it a Residential Wellness Council. According to the paperwork, it was a light-touch oversight board designed to offer guidance and cohesion to neighborhoods like ours, where lax regulation had led to disorder. It was a clever rebrand. No mention of fines, no talk of mandatory dues. Just a sugar-coated attempt to lure people back into the same trap she once ruled over with an iron clipboard. But people in Whispering Commons weren't the same residents she once strong-armed. They had seen what community looked like without fear. Still, not everyone remembered the pain Karen had caused. Some of the newer families, those who had moved in after the legal battles ended, were curious. A few were even tempted. They saw the brochures and thought, what harm could it do to have someone helping with landscaping or organizing a community newsletter? That's how Karen worked. She didn't come back swinging. She came back whispering. When I brought the packet to the next co-op meeting, I laid it out on the table like a loaded trap. Teresa Maddox, the quiet but unshakable voice of the Commons, picked up the packet and read silently for a long time before setting it down. "She's back," she said, softly, and that was all it took. Over the next week, word spread faster than a summer brush fire. Karen had already begun canvassing door to door in nearby developments, pitching her wellness counsel with honeyed words and exaggerated promises. Her goal wasn't just to reclaim Whispering Commons, it was to expand, to franchise her, control under a different name. She believed that the fallout of the old HOA had been a branding issue, not a moral one, that if she changed the language, she could retake the crown. But she forgot something fundamental. Whispering Commons was no longer the kind of place where people handed over their freedom without a fight. That's when we decided to respond, not with rage, not with lawsuits, but with a lesson in what real community looks like. We didn't organize protests or shout her out of town. Instead, we held a community gathering, an open forum in the old Commons garden, beneath the canopy of oaks, where kids still ran through sprinklers and neighbors traded pie recipes. We called it the Living Together Summit, and we invited everyone, residents, new families, nearby neighborhoods, even the press. And we invited Karen too. To our surprise, she came. Karen arrived precisely on time, dressed in a crisp beige pantsuit, holding a leather-bound binder and a smile that looked more like a barbed wire fence. She took a seat near the front, surrounded by her hand-picked team of polished associates. They didn't look like residents. They looked like corporate consultants, shiny, rehearsed, and hollow. She waited, probably expecting a town hall argument she could steer in her favor. But what unfolded was something far more devastating to her ambitions. The summit didn't start with debate. It started with testimony. One by one, residents stood and shared what life had been like during the days of the HOA. Stories of fines for planting tomatoes in the front yard, of threats over wind chimes, of Karens showing up at their doors with veiled ultimatums and printed rule books. But it wasn't just bitterness. They also spoke of the changes since the HOA's fall, how neighbors had helped rebuild a shared play structure after a storm, how people had organized tutoring groups for local kids, how conflicts had been resolved, not with citations, but with our conversations. I watched Karen's face as the stories unfolded. At first, she wore the practiced look of indifference. Then came the tight jaw, and finally the forced smile, the last defense of someone who realizes control is slipping through their fingers again. And then Teresa spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult Karen. She simply turned to the crowd and said, "We are proof that communities don't need power to be good. We need each other. That's it." Karen stood up. She smoothed her jacket, cleared her throat, and tried to salvage the moment. "I respect what this community has built," she began, "but structure is necessary. Without guidelines, neighborhoods decline. I've seen it happen. People get lazy, properties lose value, crime increases." That was her mistake, because that's when a young man named Jorge, who had just bought a home on one of the old HOA lots, stood up and said, "Funny, I've never felt safer or more connected in my life than I do here. You say we need rules. I say we already have one. It's called Don't Be a Jerk." The crowd laughed, not cruelly but joyfully. Because it was true. The simplicity of it spoke louder than any policy manual ever could. Karen looked around and realized she had lost the room. No amount of marketing gloss could hide the truth anymore. She left without a word. The next week, a few of her polished associates came back through the neighborhood with clipboards, trying to get signatures. They got none, not one. A week later, Civic Harmony Solutions LLC shut down its website. Karen's attempt at reclaiming Whispering Commons had failed, not because of law, but because of memory, because the people remembered what it felt like to be owned, and they had no intention of wearing those chains again. In the weeks that followed, the co-op expanded its outreach. They created starter kits for other neighborhoods wanting to transition away from rigid HOA structures. They launched a podcast. They started a community fund to help new families avoid predatory housing clauses. The legacy of the HOA's downfall became a blueprint for something bigger than any of us expected. Whispering Commons had been born out of conflict, but it matured through resistance, empathy, and shared purpose. It was no longer just a subdivision. It was a testament to what people could build when they were given the chance to govern themselves without fear. And as for me, I still walk my land every morning, the same path my grandfather once took. I still tend the orchard, mend the fences, and listen to the wind whisper through the pines. But now I do it not in solitude, but in solidarity with a neighborhood that grew up, stood tall, and told the world, never again. The laws that changed everything. The courtroom victory, the unraveling of Clinton's empire, and the resounding rejection of Karen's return were all defining moments for Whispering Commons. But I never imagined that our fight would echo beyond our property lines, let alone inspire legislative reform across the state. What began as a localized power struggle over land rights, corruption, and control had evolved into something broader, something heavier with consequence. And as the months rolled on, it became clear that our battle wasn't just about fences and homes, but about the unchecked authority that homeowners associations had quietly amassed over decades. The kind of power that could ruin lives under the guise of order. And for the first time in a long while, people were listening. It started subtly at first, like most policy movements do. A few journalists from larger regional outlets reached out after the community summit, wanting to profile what had happened in Whispering Commons. I gave one interview, then another. I didn't say anything dramatic, just told the truth. Explained how a man like Clinton, using the HOA as his front, had manipulated land use laws, intimidated homeowners, and nearly buried a neighborhood under fraudulent contracts and forged paperwork. I explained how we fought back, not with outrage, but with law and resilience. And perhaps most importantly, I described the quiet harm that HOAs often inflict not by accident, but by design, harming the vulnerable, weaponizing compliance, and profiting off fear. Then came a story in the Atlanta Ledger front page above the fold. The headline read, "The HOA that went too far, and the man who stood his ground." Within days, emails began pouring into my inbox, not just from curious readers or sympathetic neighbors, but from people all across Georgia and even from other states, sharing their own HOA horror stories. A veteran who'd been fined for flying a slightly oversized American flag. A mother in Augusta who had her children's sidewalk chalk drawings classified as visual disorder. An elderly couple threatened with foreclosure over a $200 weed control fee that ballooned into thousands after administrative charges. Each email carried the same undertone. We didn't know we could fight back. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with all of it. I was just a landowner, not an activist. But the more stories I read, the more I felt the weight of something that could no longer be ignored. The laws were the problem, not just the people. Clinton and Karen were symptoms, not the disease. Georgia's HOA statutes were among the most loosely enforced in the country. The balance of power was tilted so far that ordinary homeowners were often trapped in contracts they didn't understand, with boards they didn't elect, under rules they had no hand in writing. That wasn't just unfair, it was undemocratic. One email in particular stood out. It came from a state representative named James Callahan, a first-term legislator from DeKalb County who had taken interest in HOA reform after hearing about our case. He wrote plainly, "Mr. Dawson, your story is exactly the kind of case that makes the public finally pay attention. I believe it's time for the laws to change, but I need your help to show them why. I wasn't expecting that. I certainly didn't see myself testifying before any committee, but something in me stirred. My grandfather always believed land was not just something to be owned, but something to protect, for future generations, for communities, for those who didn't know how to fight the way we did. So when Representative Callahan invited me to speak at a state assembly hearing on HOA governance reform, I said yes. That day, I wore my cleanest flannel shirt and stood in front of a semicircle of polished desks and curious lawmakers. I spoke, slowly, deliberately. I told them about the day I came home to bulldozers on my land, about the lawsuits, about Karen's forged annexation letters. But more importantly, I told them what came after, about the rebirth of Whispering Commons, about how a neighborhood freed from HOA tyranny became stronger, more united, and more compassionate. I didn't yell. I didn't point fingers. I let the facts and the truth speak louder than any slogan. After I finished, they asked questions, tough ones, practical ones. But aren't HOAs necessary to preserve order? What about declining property values? How do we prevent abuse without eliminating community structure? I answered everyone the best I could, not as a legal expert, but as a man who had lived through what happens when order becomes oppression. I left the hearing unsure of what would happen next. But within a month, Callahan introduced a bill, HB 447, the Homeowners Rights and Accountability Act. It proposed major changes: transparency in HOA elections, caps on administrative fines, mandatory third-party audits for HOAs managing over 50 homes, and most importantly, an owner's right to opt out of HOA governance when clear abuse or fraud was proven. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A loud, legislative answer to the silent suffering too many homeowners had endured. For too long, the bill made waves. Lobbyists representing real estate and developer interests pushed back hard. They claimed the bill would lead to community chaos and legal instability. But the public was louder. Callahan's office was flooded with support letters, most citing Whispering Commons as their reason for believing reform was needed. The press picked up the story again. And this time, we weren't painted as angry rebels. We were community builders. Survivors of a flawed system who had built something better. After months of debates, amendments, and furious opposition from some state senators with ties to large development firms, the bill passed with a narrow but historic margin. The governor signed it into law that summer. For the first time in Georgia's history, the balance of power between homeowner and HOA had been shifted. The law was just a start, of course. Laws alone don't fix broken systems, but they shine a light. They give people tools. They make future abuse harder to bury under bureaucracy and fine print. And that's what mattered. Back in Whispering Commons, we didn't celebrate with fireworks or banners. We just kept living, planting, mending, talking. But I saw the difference. I saw it in the way neighboring communities came to our meetings, looking for advice on how to move away from their own outdated HOAs. I saw it in the way local news stations ran features on the community that changed the law. I saw it in the eyes of people who, for the first time in years, felt ownership not just of their homes, but of their futures. Sometimes, when I sit under the pecan tree my grandfather planted, I think about how much this place has changed. Not in appearance, but in spirit. We were once a cautionary tale. Now we were a blueprint. And if Karen ever decided to return again, in another form or with another name, she'd find herself walking into a community fortified not by fear, but by memory, principle, and law, because we learned, we fought, and more importantly, we rewrote the rules. Legacy, what we leave behind. Legacy is a word people often attach to fortunes, buildings, or last names etched into plaques. But the kind of legacy I came to understand wasn't made of cement or ceremony. It was made of choices, quiet, consistent, choices stacked over a lifetime like bricks in a foundation no one sees until something grand is built on top of it. After the dust settled from the courtroom fights, after the laws changed and the headlines faded, that's what remained. Not my name in bold letters, not a statue, not even a road named after me. Just a neighborhood that learned to breathe on its own. That's all I ever wanted. I never thought I'd become a symbol for anything. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't even particularly charismatic. My life had been built in solitude, one season after the next, minding the land my grandfather entrusted to me. My days were filled with tending fences, mending tools, watching trees grow taller than the rooftops that now dotted the land I once walked uninterrupted. I wasn't bitter about that. Change comes whether you want it or not. But what I came to understand, through all the court filings, meetings, protests, and the rebuilding of a fractured neighborhood, was that how change comes is what really matters. Whispering Commons didn't become a model community overnight. There were setbacks, small rifts, personality clashes, and the natural growing pains of people learning to live without the false comfort of imposed structure. We were a community that had once been ruled by a woman with a clipboard and a mandate, and when she was gone, it took time to rediscover our own voice. But day by day, we found it, and it wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, kind. The sound of kids playing in a communal garden, the smell of Sunday potlucks held under string, lights strung between two maples, the murmur of conversations on porches that once held only silence or suspicion. I walked the neighborhood often, not as an overseer, not as a landlord, but as a neighbor. It felt different now. The homes once built on stolen soil were no longer just legal victories. They were lived-in spaces filled with music, arguments, late-night laughter, and birthday parties that spilled onto the sidewalks. I watched teenagers who once wouldn't speak to each other join up to repaint the old park gazebo. I saw single parents helping each other juggle school drop-offs. And I saw something else, too. New people coming in, not to exploit or impose, but to join. People who'd heard about us from a cousin or a friend, and who came not for perfection, but for authenticity. It was during one of those walks that I was approached by a boy no older than 10, riding a beat-up bike with one pedal missing. His name was Marcus, and he lived in a 2-bedroom home with his mother, who worked double shifts as a nursing assistant. He asked if I was the man who stopped the mean lady from taking all the houses. I chuckled, not because the description was wrong, it wasn't, but because he said it with such simple certainty, like he was talking about a fairy tale. I told him, I didn't stop her. We all did. He tilted his head and said, yeah, but you started it. It stuck with me, not as pride, but as responsibility. Legacy is often measured by what you leave behind, but sometimes it's better measured by what continues to grow when you're gone. And as much as I loved my land, I knew one day I wouldn't be here to walk it anymore. I had no children of my own, no direct heirs. But I had something else, the people. And I had an idea. I spent months working with a non-profit law firm and the community co-op to draft what would become the cornerstone of Whispering Commons' future, a community trust charter. I donated the land, not the homes themselves, but the earth beneath them, to the co-op, which had now formally incorporated as a resident-managed entity. The trust ensured that no private developer could ever again buy up the soil under their feet. No hedge fund could swoop in and transform our neighborhood into a line item in some distant investor's spreadsheet. No Karen could crawl out of the woodwork with a new acronym and take control. The land would belong to the people who lived on it, managed by a board of elected stewards who rotated yearly with decisions made through public consensus. The charter mandated transparency in all financial dealings, required third-party mediation before any legal action could be taken within the community, and guaranteed freedom from mandatory association dues unless voted upon annually by a supermajority of residents. I wrote into that charter one simple line, framed as a guiding principle: no rule shall be greater than the relationship it threatens to break. When the charter was finalized, we didn't hold a grand signing ceremony. We gathered under the same pecan tree where my grandfather once carved a bench. People brought folding chairs, some brought lemonade. One woman brought her guitar and sang a song I'd never heard before about reclaiming what matters. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The people spoke with their presence, with their patience, with the way they quietly took ownership of something not handed down to them, but earned through fire. In the years that followed, other neighborhoods began to ask questions. People in surrounding towns came to visit, to see for themselves how a post-HOA community could thrive. Some came skeptical, others desperate. We shared our charter, offered advice, listened to their stories, and slowly change began to ripple outward. Not massive reform overnight, but pockets of resistance, homeowners contesting unlawful fines, small groups rewriting their bylaws, petitions to replace abusive boards with democratic, resident-led councils. They called it the Commons movement, though we never named it ourselves. And it wasn't about me. I was just a man who stood up once, held the line, and refused to bow when the bulldozers came. What mattered was that others stood too. Together. One crisp autumn morning, I stood alone on the rise above the eastern slope, the same hilltop where, years earlier, Clinton's contractors had poured the first illegal foundation. That concrete had long since been torn up, replaced with wildflowers and a small reflection pond fed by a solar-powered pump. The pond wasn't deep, but it was clear, still, honest. Kids played near it sometimes. Older folks sat there to think. It had become a kind of quiet chapel for the neighborhood. As I watched the wind stir ripples across the surface, I thought of everything we'd survived. Not just the lawsuits or the threats, but the more insidious threats. Division, apathy, fear. I thought of Karen, wherever she was now, probably trying to reinvent herself in some new suburban experiment. I didn't hate her. I pitied her, because she never understood what we'd learned. True community doesn't need control. It needs care. I left that hill with a calm heart. I knew the day would come when I wouldn't be around to tend the trees or greet newcomers. But the seeds were planted, the soil was ready, and the people knew how to keep it growing. Legacy isn't what you build, it's what remains standing when you're gone. And in Whispering Commons, I knew that long after my boots stopped walking that land, the people would still be there, rooted, resilient, and free.